Hello and welcome to the Business Interview. I'm Markus Karlsson. The global recovery remains too slow and weak. That was the message from the head of the International Monetary Fund when she spoke a few days ago. Christine Lagarde said that there are still many threats to global growth, and she called on the world's leading economies to embrace bolder policies to help the recovery. But where does that leave developing nations, and where does that leave those who are the most vulnerable in the global economy? In the next week, ministers, academics and journalists will come together for the spring meetings of the IMF and its sister institution, the World Bank. And development, the fight against poverty and corruption will be on the agenda of my guest today. Jim Yong Kim is the president of the World Bank, and he joins me now from that organization's headquarters in Washington, D.C. President Kim, I want to thank you first of all for speaking to us.
Thank you very much for having me, Marcus. It's great to be on the show.
Now, what's your message ahead of the spring meetings? What kind of threats do you see on the global horizon?
Well, there are still many, many threats, and I agree with Madame Lagarde that nobody is satisfied with the rate of growth that we're seeing, and there are many things that can be done both in terms of monetary policy and fiscal policy that would spur growth. In many of the emerging economies, one of the difficulties is that we're in the middle of many different elections. India is having an election, Turkey is having an election, Indonesia is having an election, Brazil. So there are many things that are being left until after the elections. But having said that, we're actually encouraged. If you even look at what the situation was at the end of January to today, in January there was the experience of the outflow of capital from many of the emerging market countries, but that's actually recovered in March. We also see that current account deficits have decreased. We see that bond spreads have also begun to decrease for emerging market economies. Now, there's no question there are still many things that we're worried about, but the fact that the U.S. economy seems to be growing, and the most recent employment numbers suggest that the underlying growth in the U.S. economy is in fact quite strong, and the fact that Europe and Japan are also growing is a good sign. Now, the biggest risk, one of the biggest risks, of course, is that if there is a bumpier or more rapid tapering of the United States Federal Reserve's unconventional monetary policies.
Do you think that emerging economies will take a real hit if indeed and when the Fed tapers and withdraws its stimulus?
Well, they're withdrawing it gradually, and our hope is that right now in the developing world, something like 4.6% of GDP is due to capital inflows. And so if the tapering is smooth and gradual, we think that will go from 4.6 to something like 4% around the end of 2016. And that is a level of decrease that the emerging markets can handle. The other part of it is that with the U.S. economy growing and the European and the Japanese economies also growing, that the growth in the overall economy is going to be good for exports, and that will also counteract, to an extent, the relatively slow, we hope, and gradual outflow of capital from these emerging market countries.
I want to turn on to development issues and take a closer look at them now. The World Bank is supposed to be about development and about making poor nations richer. You've stated a clear goal, and that is to eradicate extreme poverty by 2030. Will you be able to achieve that?
Well, we'll have to work hard at it. So, for example, if you look at all the numbers, if you look at poverty as a percentage of the overall global population and not poverty as a percentage of the developing world, the number in 2010 was about 17.7%. Higher than that, of course, for the developing world, but that was the number in 2010. Now, if growth continues over the next now 16 years at about the level that it occurred over the previous 16 years, then what you'll have is that poverty will reduce down to only about 7.7% if the distribution of income remains the same. So our goal is to be less than 3%. We really don't think, because of natural disasters and people moving in and out of poverty, we don't think we can ever get it really to below 3%, but 3% is the target. So as you can see, that if it's business as usual, we're not going to get there. So there's a lot of things we need to do. We have to focus on those policies that invest in the poorest, and redistribution is part of that picture.
But what is going
but also we need growth.
Pardon me for interrupting you. What is going to get us there? Are we talking just of higher growth rates, or are we going to have to change the way that the global economy is growing and how it actually works out for the poorer, the less fortunate?
Well, this is why the goal of boosting shared prosperity is so important. There's all kinds of evidence now. The IMF has been very clear about this, even in the last few months, that higher levels of inequality actually are a drag on global growth. So the approach to growth has to be different. I think there's a political recognition that if you ignore the poorest 40% of your population, you're building instability into your society. What was the lesson from the Arab Spring, if not that? They had GDP growth, but because the bottom 40% were not included, the movements erupted. And the possibility for that exists everywhere. Politicians are increasingly aware that that's the issue. So the question for us now is, how can we help countries move down a path where their economies are growing and robustly, but in a way that includes more people?
But even in
for
many,
us, the key.
Even in many emerging economies, we're seeing the gap between wealthy and poor grow. Income inequalities are growing. For instance, in China, even in China, where we're seeing pretty astounding rates of growth still, we're seeing inequalities actually growing.
Absolutely. We are seeing inequalities growing. There are a few great examples, though, where inequality has decreased. In Brazil, for example, the Brazilian governments under first President Lula and now under the current president, there's no question that they've made a very clear commitment to reducing inequality. Now, the growth numbers in Brazil are not where we'd like to see them, but the hope is that this investment in reducing inequality will help the country grow over time. And so for us, it's very clear that there are new data, new evidence. There's new evidence about how one might build a program of growth that is more equitable. For example, for the longest time, and many ministers of finance still feel this, that the expenditures in health and education are just that, expenditures. But what we know now is that these are the most critical investments you can make in your future growth. Larry Summers recently led a team that did a study of the impact of improved health outcomes, and he argued in the paper that based on multiple studies, that from 2000 to 2011, fully 24% of the growth in the developing world was because of better health outcomes.
What's the World Bank doing to adapt itself to current developments? You've outlined an ambition to change the World Bank. In what direction do you want to take it in order to adapt yourself to this new reality?
Well, you know, Marcus, after I graduated from college, my first experience of coming to Washington, D.C. was to participate in a movement called 50 Years is Enough. And we were out in the streets arguing that the World Bank on its 50th anniversary should close. So I'm very glad that we lost that argument. But back in those days, the objection that we were raising was that the World Bank was not paying enough attention to the critical investments in human beings and human capital that we just knew sort of in our gut was the right thing to do. But as this evidence has accumulated, the World Bank has changed direction tremendously, and we are now leaders in investing in health, education. We're certainly leaders in investing in the kind of social protection programs that have been so effective. But here at the World Bank, we're going through a major change. We're going through really 4 major changes in the organization that I am told that in any previous year, any one of those changes would have been thought of as an earthquake. But what we're trying to do is to build an organization that's fit for purpose. Now, what does that mean? Well, first and foremost, what we know is that foreign assistance, all of foreign assistance is about $125 billion, is nowhere near enough to meet the needs of the developing world. Africa alone has $100 billion in new infrastructure needs every year. You look at the BRICS countries as a whole, all of the 5 together have about $1 trillion a year of infrastructure needs. So the 125 and even our 50 to 60 billion is not going to be enough to meet that demand. What we're going to have to do, and especially here at the World Bank, because we have both the public and private sector parts of the World Bank, we're bringing them together really for the first time so that we can work on the kinds of solutions where we take precious official development assistance, precious foreign assistance, and make sure that those investments are done in a way so that private sectors can grow.
Let me ask you this, though.
Last year we released a report. Go ahead.
Let me ask you this, though. The World Bank has previously been criticized for pushing an agenda of liberalization, deregulation, and other requirements in return for loans from your institution. Does that mean what you're saying? Does that mean that that is going to change from now on?
Well, in the past, the World Bank has been criticized for being ideological in the way that it applied policy recommendations and also really conditions. We've really moved away from that over the last 20 years, and that we don't talk about conditionalities anymore. And everything we do is negotiated with the leaders of countries. Now, for example, in terms of regulations, our position now is that the role of, for example, the private sector versus the public sector in critical social programs like health and education, that we have to look at those country by country. We used to recommend, for example, even throughout Africa, that every country should institute user fees for health services. But the evidence came back that said that that was actually worsening health outcomes. And so if the World Bank is anything, we are an institution that both generates new data and evidence, and then when we generate it, we listen to it. So the evidence is now clear. We are not taking ideological approaches. In any given country, we're going to have this discussion about what kind of regulations are needed, what kind of role the public sector is going to play, and what kind of role the private sector is going to play. But that conversation has to start first and foremost inside the World Bank. That's what we're starting.
All right, Jae-myung Kim, the president of the World Bank. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap it up there because we have run out of time. I want to thank you, though, sir, for taking the time to speak to us here at France 24. With that, we're going to wrap up the program. Thanks to you at home as well for watching, and do stay with us. We have more news coming your way.